Good afternoon or good morning, Professor Abdulaziz. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. How are you doing, Bassam?
I'm doing well and very happy that we are launching our first podcast, the MEIS podcast, Middle East and Islamic Studies program podcast, and excited that you are our first inaugural guest. So there's a lot of pressure on you.
Oh, yes, yes. It's welcome. It's welcome.
My name is Bassam Haddad. I'm the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University, and we are launching this podcast to introduce our faculty, students, and administrative team to the GMU community and beyond. But we are starting with our formidable professor Abdulaziz Sachedina, who is a who has a long list that we can address, and I will actually share with you some of his book covers, titles, and snippets of his bio throughout. But first, I would like to ask Aziz the first question I'll be asking everyone: how are you doing in COVID times?
Well, it's a challenging time, but we have adjusted quite well. I'm surprised that we adjusted quite well, despite all the difficulties and not seeing our students, not meeting our colleagues. All I think we still have managed to remain healthy, and alert.
Same here. It's been very tough, but I'm glad that you are safe and everyone around you is safe. We've talked before, so I know about that. So that's wonderful. We'll proceed today with a few questions about your research, teaching, and activities. But let me start by introducing you to our GMU community and beyond. Professor Abdulaziz Sachedina is a professor and triple IT chair in Islamic Studies at George Mason University on the Fairfax campus. Dr. Sachedina, who has studied in India, Iraq, Iran, and Canada, obtained his PhD from the University of Toronto. He has been conducting research and writing in the field of Islamic law, ethics, and theology, Sunni and Shi'i, um, for more than 2 decades. In the last 10 years, he has concentrated on social and political ethics, including interfaith and intra-faith relations, Islamic biomedical ethics, and Islam and human rights. Dr. Sachedina's publications include Islamic Messianism, from the State University of New York, Human Rights and the Conflicts of Culture, also co-authored, The Just Ruler in Shi'i Islam or Shiite Islam, the Prolegomena to the Quran, the Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism, Islamic Democratic Pluralism. These are two different books. Islamic Biomedical Ethics, Theory and Application from Oxford University in 2009, and Islam and the Challenge of Human Rights, which I think are the two latest volumes. In addition to numerous articles in academic journals, and there's a lot more that I will not say because we need to get to the to the conversation. Your presence at George Mason has enriched our community, and we are very excited that students have an opportunity to attend your classes and engage with you. Professor Sachedina, if you can tell us a little bit about your intellectual journey, with some focus on your publications and research, including what's coming next. I know there's a book coming up next.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to be the first person to speak to MEIS community as well as GNU community. And it's my pleasure to share my very personal journey into my scholarship because I think that we who teach and do research, we continuously are growing with our teaching and with our students' challenges to us, their criticism of what we do and how we do it. And I think that it has all added up to my interest in diverse topics. I started off, doing research in Shiism, and I thought that I would continue to do that for a long time to come. But then there was this, idea in my mind that what's the knowledge if this knowledge has no relevance today? And in order for me to do the classical Orientalist type studies, Shiism was a good topic. I could have gone back and forth in the classical sources, reading them, interpreting them, providing new insights into them. But then I said, well, I think that my studies in law itself are challenging, because that law that I'm talking about is usually described as juridical corpus. It is no more, as if it is no more being applied anywhere. So I thought that, well, there's something very closely connected with the law, and that's ethics. That's how I moved from Shiism, theology, history of ideas, to the idea of how do I make that knowledge applicable today? And my only way out was actually to look at the politics, to look at the society, look at what people are expecting of the new kind of understanding the religion should provide. So my area moved from theoretical, classical, Orientalist type of philological studies to how that knowledge can be applied today. So that's where I enter the idea of ethics. And my last volume on ethics is actually the summation of all my research done thus far. And it is going to be another controversial book from me, because I'm challenging the old ideas about ethics being simply Aristotelian ethics. And I'm now connecting ethics with the law. So it is, I think, that kind of study that if you took a look at the Islamic biomedical ethics book, it's dealing with the classical sources, but it is more interested in how the classical sources are speaking to the modern society, modern physicians, whether they're Muslims or non-Muslims. There is something common in ethical reflections that include all human beings. So I think that I've been successful in connecting the classical knowledge with the modern application. I tried to do that in Shiism, but it somehow blocked my ability to move on, because I was in theology, and theology did not really allow me to move away from the classical creedal explanations. So I think that the first book that I wrote about that possibility was, other than the biomedical ethics, it was the Islamic roots of pluralism, democratic pluralism. And I think that what I did was, in this book, I teased out for the first time how classical interpretation of the Quran, classical studies of the theology could be applicable today to understand the new challenges of how to democratize the society. What are the challenges awaiting communities of religion, whether they're intra-faith or interfaith? It's all needs to be anchored in the classical sources. And the reason why I say this quite clearly is that I think Middle Eastern scholarship is very much bound to the Arabic and Persian, more so to these two languages than Turkish. And therefore, you see, when we speak about hermeneutics, we speak about the textual information, we are talking about Arabic sources, we are talking about Persian sources that are classical, and how to make those sources available today to the modern readership. I could talk to my fellow colleagues in Near Eastern studies, in Middle Eastern studies, but I was unable to talk to people in politics, to people in sociology, anthropology. And I think that was my aim, and that pushed my journey in a very radical way to something far more exciting. Because classical studies, yes, they were interesting, but there was what we call a kind of a status quo. You go to the classical sources, you study them, you reinterpret them, you provide new interpretation, new insight, but that's it. Where does this knowledge take us? What does this knowing do to us, do to my students, do to the communities as such? And that was my aim that took me to the Islam and human rights. I said, well, human rights cannot be speaking to the religious communities only at the secular level. They need to speak to the religious communities in their own language. Is their language capable of capturing the idea of rights the way you and I know in the modern rights discourse today? If they're not able to do that, then we are talking about human rights, but we are not talking about what Islam can or cannot do about promoting it, about, making people aware of it. So that was a challenge for my book on Islam and human rights. I think that book, Islam and Human Rights, Challenge of Human Rights, I wrote it without considering any consequences of my classical teachers and what they would say about it, because I was now departing from the classical knowledge and bringing the classical knowledge in conversation with the modern knowledge. How do we sit down with secularists and convince them about the things that are important in our own understanding about the human rights today?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Professor Sachedina. This is really full, and I was following what you shared because I've heard you address these matters in lectures, and I've read about your work. How do we translate the kinds of, before we get to the teaching, I'm going to ask you one question. How do we translate the kinds of challenges and struggles and the debunking of existing conventional notions that are at that more advanced level? How do we translate it into a language that is accessible, say, to undergrads? This is the kind of thing that I think about when I'm trying to communicate these debates that sort of are quote unquote the kinds of debates that a lot of us in academia are concerned with. But when we're dealing with newcomers to the field of Islam, to the Middle East, how do we translate those debates to them in ways that would make sense? I know it's a
You see,
challenge.
there are two. Yeah, this is a very important question, Bassam. I think that what I need to explain here for my audience today is that classical studies tend to become very much um, controlled by the ivory tower mentality. We are in the ivory tower. We need to establish to our peers that we can read the text, we can, interpret them, translate them, and we can impress people in juridical studies, we can impress people in theological studies, philosophical studies about what Islamic texts are talking about. I think that's fine. I think that is being covered in the Near Eastern studies, Near Eastern civilizations and cultures. But what we stop there is, because I'm the product of that program, Near Eastern studies, because I come out of that program and I see quite clearly that my role was always to open the classical text, tell my audience what I have discovered and how the past authorities did not see it what I see today. Because that's the new thing that comes out in the new thesis that we develop and the new hypothetical approach to some of the theological ideas, some of the philosophical ideas and how we apply them. My concern was to move away from that and to translate that information for my modern studentship. My modern studentship is more reflective in a sense. They want to see the reality of what this knowledge is all about. Yes, Orientalists did work on philology. They did provide good ways of studying the language, interpret the classical sources, and bring about, a good understanding of the grammar, of the syntax, of the historical context, etc. But they did not move beyond that because that was not their aim and objective. Their aim and objective was to expose the readership, to what was available in the classical sources, and the way they saw it and the way they interpreted the culture and civilization of the Muslims. Whereas I was looking for relevance. My student today, my undergraduate student, want to know, so what? If you know these texts and if you have read them in the original languages and you can interpret for us, so what for me today as a modern student, undergraduate student? I don't know the languages you know, and I don't know how to interpret them. I depend on you. You tell me how to make that knowledge relevant to me as a modern individual looking for my own identity in the multicultural society, in the multi faith society, in a society that is global today. It is no more limited to one nationality. We are Americans, yes, but we are Americans living in a global society. We are no more isolated. We are no more separated by Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean on both sides of our continent. We are now connected through internet, through cyberspace, with the whole world at a given moment. Even while I'm speaking now, I am available to all the people, whoever is interested in what I'm saying. So that kind of translatability I believed in from day one. Because what my idea was that my study in the classical literature and classical languages would provide me the necessary credibility that I need to speak. If I was speaking in Middle East, for example, about Islamic law, if I did not make any reference to Shafi'i's Risala, to Shafi'i's important contribution, Imam Abu Hanifa's, interpretive jurisprudence, nobody would believe me. Nobody is willing to listen to me. Now that I can quote them and I can still tell them that that interpretation that you are locked into has to be unlocked. And you need to go beyond that to see the relevance today in the search for a new method of interpreting the law, interpreting the intentions and objectives of the divine lawgiver. Or is it accessible to you? What is the relationship between your reasoning ability and the textual authority that is claiming a kind of absolute application? All of these things become part of my inquiry into the translatability of the past culture today for my students who have no idea what the classicists have said. I want to make them available what Plato is about, what Aristotle is about, what Ibn Sina is about. All these scholars, all these philosophers in the classical age, they spoke to their own times. And now I want to see whether I can translate their ideas into the modern society with for my students who are going to somehow understand what I'm saying about the relevance of the knowledge that I have accumulated all these years. I've spent 50 years of my lifetime studying them, studying from my different teachers. Even now, I have teachers. Even now, when I go to Iran or Iraq, I study with my teachers. I sit with them. I discuss with them. They are all, I'm all, and we still argue and we still disagree with one another. What is, I think, important that I have, collected in my journeys, in my scholarship journey is that my student wants to know what ideas are going to be translated by me for them in the classrooms and in my writings.
Wow. Okay. So this means that we have to talk again because I have so many questions and I'd like to ask about a few things that you mentioned that are relevant to a tangent, perhaps, but something that's related to teaching about Islam and the Middle East in the United States. But we will keep that to another conversation, which I hope you can grant me. For now, if we could ask you a little bit about your teaching at George Mason. What are the classes you offer? I know you are a central part of the Middle Eastern Studies program curriculum. You teach a course that is required for the master's program, and other courses. If you can share with us some of the courses you're teaching, give us just a snippet about each. I would really appreciate it.
You're right. I think I need to mention as a footnote that I am trained as a historian. I was trained in University of Toronto as a historian of Iran, and I my specialization area was Safavid Empire and its relationship with Mughal Empire in India and the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. So that's my training. So in many all my courses, history plays a very central role. I connect ideas to the historical periods. And the historical periods allow me to teach courses like Islam in the modern age. Islam in the modern age has to start historically somewhere. And it is not medieval Islam, it's not classical Islam alone. It is Islam in general. How do I interpret the civilizational movement? How do I interpret the way the culture developed and the way the synthesis occurred and the way it found its own voice within so many, in the context of so many other voices competing for attention. So my courses deal with history, history of ideas, history of institutions. I want to see that I can teach a course on Islam, democracy, and human rights at undergraduate level so that my students begin to appreciate how the knowledge about that religion becomes relevant today in the democratization process, in the human rights promotion process. All of these things are connected there. I also am very keen to teach law, ethics, and Islamic society. How these ideas are playing out in the development of the new modern society. By the way, all my teaching today is in the context of modernity. I'm not um, I'm not talking in the vacuum of history. I'm talking within history in the modern times. And therefore, my methodology, although it takes me to the textual hermeneutics, to the textual ideas and insights that I get, but it is also connected with my interpretation today as a modern scholar. I'm the product of modern university. I'm the product of also the seminaries that are operating in the modern world. When I studied in Iraq or when I studied in Iran, uh, everywhere I was, operating as a modern individual, although it was in the madrasa environment. It was in the classical, studies environment where you studied the text with your teacher and the teacher, interpreted for you. You took your notes in in your writings and everything, but it was person to person communication between me and my teacher, which continues even now as I go and do the field work. So that's what I'm trying to translate into my teaching. My course, for example, on Shia and Sunni theology. There's hardly any program in the universities in North America that is interested to teach something like Shia Sunni theology. There might be new ones coming up, but I still remember that the University of Virginia, where I was teaching for a long time, Shia Sunni relationship, Shia Sunni theologies was the most popular course for the students to learn about the two major schools of thought in the Islamic world, especially when you look at the politics today. They cannot be simply, Saudi Arabia and Iran cannot be explained simply as the two power centers, but they're also ideologically Shia and Sunni. And therefore, we need to understand Shia and Sunni theologies and the dynamics of the ideas in the two schools of thought and the way they impact upon the political decisions and political conversation today. So my courses are geared towards, combining what I do in my research and what I know as a student when I was a student and what my students need today in the MEIS Middle East and Islamic Studies program, as well as religious studies. And I have students taking my courses from history department. They're also from political science department. And they all are taking these courses in order for them to understand how the way I see the dynamic connection between religion and politics and Islam, the way I interpret these ideas. And I haven't taught that course in university in GMU, but I used to teach that course in UVA. This was religion and politics in Islam, where I discuss my understanding of what religion and politics is all about. But I know that such courses are being taught, so I have not tried to teach them here to replicate what others are doing.
Wow, that was very instructive, Abdulaziz, or Aziz, as you sometimes ask us to call you. Um, Again, I have a set of questions, but I'm going to bypass them as this is the inaugural episode of the new MEIS podcast, and we would like to set some sort of expectations as to what we're addressing. We've talked about your intellectual journey and your publications, as well as your teaching. My last question, or a set of smaller questions, revolve around what do you think, or what do you actually do outside the classroom in terms of your scholarship? What sort of activities, and what are the sorts of things that people can engage with if they are not students and that they'd like to engage with you in terms of public lectures or things of the sort? And in order to make this question a bit more efficient, if you can also tell us in that regard, um, where is the study of Islam going in today's world, in today's United States, and how does that connect with your activities?
This is very interesting question, and I have been actually an advocate for it that we academicians need to reach out the communities in which we live, whether it is churches, mosques, synagogues. We need to be available to them, and I do that. By the way, I am speaking to different churches and mosques and sometimes synagogues, that I'm invited to. So I reach out, and I think that there's a lot of interest in the larger community to understand Islam generally and to understand some of the ideas that seem to be odd in the modern times. When you see militancy in the name of Islam, when you see violence in the name of Islam, when you see Islamic State, ISIS, all of these ideas that are part of the global understanding of what the people are doing today in order to, demand the radical solution to the modern problems, I think that there is a lot of interest around the world, and I go around the world to speak on these topics. But my major area today, for which I'm invited more often, is biomedical ethics, because there's a lot of interest in end of life decisions, organ donation. What exactly is the religious position? Can there be a conversation between a religious bioethics like Islamic bioethics and secular bioethics, which is not anchored in any religion, but it is anchored in the rational and human experience of the clinical situation. So all of these things are encouraging, many centers around the world as well as in the North American context, where people want to understand the relationship between religion and medicine. What exactly is the relationship between religion and medicine? I have not been actively sought out at the George Mason University in our health studies program about my contribution, and I have actually offered them. And I mentioned this not as a complaint, but as it's a big university, so they don't know there is someone who is existing at GMU who was, who is in demand for the biomedical ethics, all over the world. And how come this university is not using his expertise? So there is, this um, perhaps neglect on the part of programs in the GMU itself that is sometimes causing me a kind of a disappointment that, well, how come, we are not able to do that? How come we are not, able to bring the resources that we have in our hands uh, to better inform our nurses, to better inform our public health officers. How exactly are we going to deal with people with the religious ideas? People today in the age of vaccination, now that we are looking at it, we are now talking to the religious communities that you need to go forward. Or what about the risks that are involved? Aren't we supposed to, you know, not put ourselves in harmful situations? And here we are, the ones who go and interpret for them that what does harm mean? What does risk mean? What is the benefits of this, all of this? So we are the ones who are negotiating the space for vaccinations in the communities. So when we do that in communities, why can't we do this in our own universities? So that's the question that comes up quite often in my mind. And I was actively involved in the UVA biomedical program. I was teaching in the hospital, etc. All of these things, because after all, we don't have that medical school here, but we have public health institution in the university, and we need to reach out, to those who can provide, who can contribute richly to this university's future and the student body that is coming here more and more, with expecting that kind of challenge in our university.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachedina. What do you suggest would be some of the ways to improve the communication of these ideas within our community and beyond? There's so much happening at George Mason. It's one of the most fledgling places that I have seen, and I have, I travel quite well over the past few decades, and I actually was an undergraduate at George Mason in the '80s, and I've seen it grow to an enormous extent, to the point where you can't keep up. One can't keep up with what's happening in terms of events, in terms of the expansion, and so on. What this podcast is partly in response to some of these needs to expand our reach and make what we do at the Middle East and Islamic Studies program known. Are there other things that you think we can do in addition that would deliver what you're suggesting?
Yes, I think that I, having traveled around the world, having taught in different universities around the world, and having taught in our public schools, I think that we in the public schools need to be far more open to different disciplines interacting with one another. When we talk about multidisciplinary studies, which Middle East is going to be all the time, all Middle Eastern studies, Islamic studies, religious studies, all of it is going to be multidisciplinary study, because there is not only one discipline. There is not only social sciences that is involved in it. There is also humanities involved in it. In other words, uh, GMU, my experience of the last 10 years has taught me that we are very territorial when it comes to our areas of control. So political science remains an enclave. It doesn't want to talk to the people in religious studies. Whereas at UVA, where I taught for more than 3 decades, I was part of the political science department. I was part of the sociology. I was part of the anthropology. And nothing of that has happened in 10 years. And MEIS is open to sociology, anthropology, political science, or psychology. You can name any field, because I had students at UVA who were in parapsychology and who were also working in religious studies, Islamic studies with me. In other words, there are enormous possibilities if only we can abandon territorialism that is controlling not only our mind but our ability to converse with our fellow colleagues. We are not in conversation with one another. It is the conversation that actually encourages our students to engage with us. So I know there are many students in political science who are working on, let's say, Iran or Iraq or Middle East. I have never met them. At least in this university, I've never met them. So there is this kind of lacuna, that kind of, absence, which needs to be overcome. We need to go beyond our field to look at our colleagues' works and to look at their contributions so that we can involve them in what we are doing. Why is it that we are not able to do it when we all serve the same student body? We serve the same academic program. And we are all concerned about the well being, educational well being, and also sociological well being of our students. Why not work more closely with one another, realizing what each one is doing? We don't even know who is doing what. So we
Well,
don't have that kind of situation
you
which we need to overcome at GM.
you I hear you. You'll be glad to know that as I've shared with our colleagues at the program, that we are actually trying to revive a sort of cross-field, cross-disciplinary, cross-program effort in order to do exactly that. The issue we're facing at George Mason, based on our research at the Middle East and at the Middle East Pedagogy Initiative project, is something that is faced in almost all universities, not always to the same extent, but there is something that one needs to sort of address in that regard, to sort of blur, if not break, sometimes the boundaries between disciplines and subfields. And this is the sort of thing that, by the way, is necessary to do within one's own research, not just within a particular institutional setup. Within one's own research, we need to become far more intersectional than we have been. And that is a huge challenge because it does require retooling. It does require going back to the, the board, to the studying board. And frankly, a lot of people are not willing to do this. And it could be very much a generational thing where your students, our my students, would actually be perhaps more prepared to do because they are starting from an earlier period. But this is something that does need to happen: the blurring of boundaries, both within one's research and also within an institutional setup. Which I, incidentally, we're publishing a newsletter on pedagogy at the Middle East Pedagogy Initiative, MESP, Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative, MESP.org. And it actually has been addressing and continues to address those very issues because they're ubiquitous challenges faced from the East Coast to the West Coast, North and South, and certainly beyond the United States. But we are making an effort here at George Mason in order to address this by bringing together various programs. At first, global and area studies programs, and then hopefully moving beyond the actual area studies to the disciplines and to the departments. So thank you so much for addressing this and putting even more pressure on me and others to actually move with this project, on the one hand. And on the other hand, thank you for a very rich conversation, which I kind of, this is false advertising, I have to admit. I have actually shared with you that it'll be about 20 to 30 minutes. We are now at about 40 minutes, 41 minutes. So, or probably going to be a little bit more by the time we finish. So, but these are the exceptions we can make with inaugural podcasts. This is the inaugural episode. And before I leave everyone, and before we leave everyone, let me ask you if you have any last, closing words, anything you'd like to say about our community here at George Mason, about the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, and about maybe what you're going to do in the future in terms of your research and activities and what we should look forward to. It's open ended, but I want to leave the last word to you.
Thank you so much, Bassam. I think we are positioned geographically and intellectually very close to what things happen in Washington area. The Washington is not only the source of so many foundations and so many groups working on different ideas, but it is also providing us a good number of students who could be interested in what we are doing. So we need to work hard on making ourselves more publicly visible in the area so that we can have that kind of attraction for the students to come to us. I think the university thrives on students coming to study with, with professors, with teachers, and those who then leave a mark in the field of intellectual development. We are at the stage, and George Mason University. I still remember 10 years ago when I started my teaching here. My colleagues were all worried that I might run away from George Mason University. But no, I find that George Mason University has offered me a way of developing my interests in a very different way. And my students here are working students. They're hardworking. They're providing their own life with resources and then coming to study with us. So they are so valuable to us. They're so important to us because they're not pampered students. They don't come from the elite group that, has no concern about the value of what they get here. So I think that our role is going to be far more challenging, but also far more satisfactory. I'm not, I'm not really satisfied if if I cannot help my students to think differently. And I think that um, it is a rare opportunity for us in the Middle Eastern studies, especially Middle East Islamic studies, for us to make a very positive contribution to what we can give to our students. Especially, we need to provide them with a lot of opportunities in the graduate studies so that our PhD students in our fields could become our spokesperson for the way we are teaching them methodologies and the way we are teaching them how to handle scholastic issues in a very academic fashion, because that's the major contribution that I find I'm able to do. As a Muslim, I might be, influenced by my belief. But what academia has taught me is that you are academic first, then a believer. And that's what I think has enriched my students who study with me, that no, academic issues need to be handled academically, and we need to be far more critical of what we do. Faith is important for our personal lives, but it is not the key for for our movement in the academic world. And then I think that's what has been a very important way of the way I have learned and I have grown myself. I have matured. In the 50 years that I've been teaching, I have changed dramatically from what I was to what I am now today. And this is thanks to my students and the institutions that gave me the opportunity to teach there.
Of course, I want to ask you how that change happened, but we will keep that to the next interview. I'll publicly pressure you to come on again and talk about strictly journey type issues. And this podcast will be broad enough to handle and be capable of addressing all sorts of issues, not just profiling in a good way, and exhibiting the resources we have in terms of professors, students, and administration and what have you. So thank you for that last comment, Aziz, and I hope we see you again soon in the corridors of George Mason. Given that now it's actually very uneven in terms of presence on campus, but I'm certain that in the next few months we will see each other. Shukran, and
Thank
have a wonderful
you.
day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Bassam. Thank you. It's
Shukran.
wonderful to
Salam.
be with you. Salam.